Professor Fuad insisted that I open the session tonight. He didn't tell me what I was supposed to do, so I will declare it open. I'm chairman of the ISU Committee on Lectures, and we're very happy and proud to be a co-sponsor of this evening's lecture by a distinguished scientist who also had some training, I guess you'd call it training, at ISU. So I'll declare this session officially open and turn it over to Dr. Robert Hansen, who will introduce our distinguished speaker.
It may be hard to notice it looking at him, but our speaker tonight is a farm boy by birth and training. Comes from the wilds of Maine, and did his bachelor's degree at Bates, and subsequently took his PhD from Harvard, where he acquired an accent which has persisted to this day. Following this, he spent a year as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California at Los Angeles, and then arrived here at the same time I did. And I'll tell you, we had lots of fun. So that he was here, and we were colleagues in the chemistry department for a period of 9 years, and nobody failed to be aware when George Hammond was in the room, even if there were 300 other people in the room, because he was at that time and remains to this day a highly articulate man with a wide range of opinions, forcefully expressed, and I will go into that a little more later on. He is a very distinguished chemist, organic chemist, but we don't hold that too badly against him. And he has won 2 American Chemical Society awards for his research in organic chemistry, the American Chemical Society Award in Petroleum Chemistry and the James Flack Norris Award in Physical Organic Chemistry. And he is a member of the National Academy of Science, and as a matter of fact, will be the Foreign Secretary of the National Academy of Sciences, I think beginning the 1st of July. George is an extremely interesting man. As I say, he has opinions on everything, and they are very articulately expressed. They have been expressed in basic science. They have strongly impacted the structure of chemical education, and he has been a member of the Committee on Professional Training in the American Chemical Society for years and years, and has had a very, very strong effect on its policies and pronouncements, and I would say generally on the chemical curriculum in the United States. After he left Iowa State, he went to Caltech, thinking that he was going to work there in peace, I guess, but they quickly made him chairman of the chemistry department out there, and you would think he would have got enough doing that, but he wound up taking a job as vice president of academic affairs at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And I think I ought to illustrate a little bit. We were talking tonight, actually Dr. Fuad commented that there is a rumor that he is to be foreign secretary of the National Academy of Sciences, but I don't know whether I can say that. And George said, yes, you can say that. Now I want to tell you about one other thing that was rumored and didn't come to pass, so you get a little bit of an idea of how forcefully he does express his opinion. It was rumored that George was going to be deputy director of the National Science Foundation. And in fact, it was so widely rumored that it appeared in the papers all over the country, if the truth be known, one of those kinds of rumors. Well, it turned out that there was a certain invasion of Cambodia somewhere around that time. There was a large protest meeting at Caltech. There was need for a distinguished faculty member to address these students, and you can guess the person the students selected, our friend. And our friend persuaded them that the wise course of action was political action and not breaking windows, and he suggested, that they band together, go to work, and vote the characterization deleted out of office. Unfortunately, the Los Angeles Times published this speech but forgot to delete the characterization. There were certain organizations in Washington, a certain trend in there. There was a quick committee meeting in the Oval Room, and it was pointed out that this man was now on the enemy list and that the proper thing to do was verb deleted him. The consequence of this is that this rumor never came to pass, and pursuing their activities further, they saw to it that he was made an academic vice president at Santa Cruz to complete this treatment. But in any event, George Hammond has, as you see, spoken on many subjects, and tonight he is going to talk on a subject which has also been very dear to his heart in recent years, and that is the transfer of science to developing countries, and he has been particularly interested in science education there. But tonight he is going to talk on science and technology transfer, how, which, and why. We are delighted to have George Hammond back with us.
Thanks, Joplin. You know, just a few minutes ago, Charlotte Roderick and I were talking about 1948 when you and I and she and Fred Duke and a number of other people came. We decided that was a damn good year. It's always a pleasure to come back to Iowa State because I still feel a very strong identification with loyalty to this institution. It was a terrific place to work for 10 years, and it still is. It was also a real experience to get off the plane yesterday afternoon in Des Moines and drive up here and realize again just how incredibly green, lush, and beautiful Iowa is at this time of year. It's incomparably fine in some ways at some times. And I didn't delete anything there either. And it's also a real pleasure and honor to be invited to participate in this very interesting and timely symposium. It's interesting and timely because a lot of people, including myself, have more or less assumed during the past 25 years the transfer of science and technology from the highly developed countries to less developed countries can and will play a beneficent role in the development of those countries. Now, as Norman Dahl said this afternoon, the premise is now being regarded rather skeptically by a lot of people. And I find myself reviewing the idea very carefully at this time. Obviously, this is a responsibility which weighs heavily upon me because the Foreign Office of the Academy of Sciences and its Board on Science and Technology for International Development have actually played rather important roles in this country's action in the arena. And clearly it becomes my responsibility to make decisions and take actions and so forth concerning the future of this action. I think we will continue to do so, and that intent the intent to really increase the effort has actually been enunciated recently by the creation of the International Commission on Science and Technology as a part of the National Research Council. At the present time, that commission is chaired by the Foreign Secretary of the National Academy. Another thing that's occurred to me, become very obvious to me, is that the present active role of the Academy in science and technology for international development really began only 12 years ago when Harrison Brown was first elected as Foreign Secretary. And as I learn the details of the present activities of the Foreign Office and what's gone on before, I'm just more and more impressed by the truly monumental job that Harrison has done in building a creative working program. His clearly is going to be a hard act to follow. However, one of the good things that he leaves behind him is established a style of action which, for the Foreign Office, which is sufficiently dynamic and entrepreneurial to provide a very suitable format for flexible adaptation of the activities of the office to a changing world. Now, it's quite clear, I think, from what we've heard already today, and will become more clear as we go on tomorrow, that to remain viable, programs are going to have to change, and change a lot. And this challenging reality is, of course, very much on my mind right now. Now, I know that there have been some changes in my own rather naive attitudes, which have occurred over the past half dozen years. I suspect that more change will occur within myself, and I believe that the views of those with whom I work, both at home and abroad, are going to be in a similar state of flux. 2 days ago, a report of considerable significance arrived on my desk. It was by Doctors John Montgomery and Milton J. Esmond, who evaluated the results of Academy activities in 5 countries: Taiwan, Indonesia, Ghana, Colombia, and Brazil. I haven't yet thoroughly digested their findings, but I believe they've produced a rather important document. I'd like to quote something from the introduction. They say, "Scientists, planners, politicians, and administrators have participated widely in making policies governing the use of scientific and technological knowledge for development purposes, but their efforts have been diffuse and dispersed. The experience has not been examined even enough to define the issues, let alone resolve them." And I think this is, in fact, a fair and accurate statement of the situation which we face as we talk about doing effective, active things in the international arena. Now, let's begin with something which probably may have some purpose in this excellent symposium. That's to pay a little bit of attention to the meaning of some of the words that we use. Now, I suspect that there is actually some variation in the meaning of the word science to even the people in this room. And I'll guarantee that there is much greater dispersion in the perceived meaning of the word technology. Now, if you go farther and put on modifiers like pure and applied, attach them to science, things become even more turgid. And you can even start fights if you try to identify that part of the panorama of things which is called science to find out what's real science. That gets to be very sticky. Now, you might expect that there'd be far greater diversity in the meanings of these terms if you look worldwide. Now, in actuality, I find that the scope of difference is just about the same in other parts of the world as you would find it on this campus, or at least in the city of Ames. Now, why is this so? I think that this fact alone really indicates that exportation of semantics and the peculiar value system of Western scientists has actually occurred to a very large extent. I mean, this is a consequence of our exporting process. Now, the uniformity of this exportation process is really a little bit frightening, because I'm not entirely sure that our whole bag of scientific values is a very worthwhile input for nations which are struggling with problems of physical survival and national identity. Now, I don't propose that we try to attach some rigid definitions to these words which we can continue using all the time. To do so would be probably unduly arrogant and it wouldn't work anyway. However, I think we ought to recognize that important variations do exist. And so the thing you hear a person saying, even talking in very common sounding language, may be not what he is saying at all, or at least not exactly. For example, there's general acceptance of the fact that anyone who holds a degree in physics and chooses to call whatever his work is physics can also, without argument, call the work science. But for most of the others of us, life is more complex. Now, a number of years ago, the term engineering sort of fell into relatively low regard, and many people started to change their titles to applied science. And some of them tried very hard to adopt a style of work which would make them indistinguishable from physical scientists. Now, at the present time, I note with real satisfaction that the tide is turning and the term engineering science is becoming popular, and this rather pleases me. Now, this may all seem like very harmless and silly kind of game playing, but the game has an unfortunate impact on the international transfer process. I sense, for example, a loosening in science classifications in this country at this time, and this is something that I welcome. But I actually find that in many countries, things are still just as rigid as they were here 10 years ago. And so this means some kinds of lively and what seem like fruitful communication to us don't really ring a bell. For example, last year in Ghana, I found that systems engineering was really an unknown concept. And the people in that country are still in the stage of very carefully differentiating between pure and applied science and between either of those and engineering, and show very little inclination to contaminate each other by mixing them together. And this, of course, is a handicap in transoceanic conversation at the present time because we're moving away from that. Now, the verbal communication problem becomes even worse when we turn to technology. Here there are real international differences. People in the LDCs are incredibly eager to develop technological capabilities, and they're anxious to beg, buy, or steal technology from the overdeveloped countries, as the ODCs. Unfortunately, sometimes the vagaries of language make articulation of these desires so difficult that a minister of planning frequently cannot even tell himself what's wanted or decide which strategy is most appropriate for acquisition of what his country needs. Now, part of the problem is that the minister in distress, part of it may arise from his attempts to emulate the mechanisms for science technology consultation that have developed in this country. Our system is really simplistic. Research is supported for the most part by government or by proprietary industrial laboratories. Scientists and engineers, singly or in groups, give advice to government about the implications of research for development or modification of technology in the public interest. Now, although scientists are very avid advisors, the advice is likely to go unheard unless it's given on demand. An interesting feature of the charter of the National Academy of Science is that it must respond to requests from the federal government for advice in areas requiring scientific expertise. Now, I don't think we can make a case for the effect that our system has worked especially well, and there is evidence that it works still less well in other countries. Now, scientists on the whole tend to be somewhat myopic in outlook and often seek out only those parts of a complex problem that relate closely to their own work, rather than attempting the rather risky task of trying to view the problem in something like its entirety. Now, and then when a scientist does get stimulated to try a global view of a problem, He often retreats to essentially the same tactics of guess and intuition that are already used by non-scientists. And it's really terribly difficult not to do this because we don't have great expertise as scientists and engineers for dealing effectively in analytical ways with a truly complex. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's simply something that we must realize and live with. Now, the upshot of this is that, with few exceptions, I think that scientific input into national technology has not been very efficient in this country. The system has worked more or less because our affluence has allowed inefficiency to be tolerated. We've been able to make many errors which a poor nation couldn't afford. Unfortunately, we not only try to export some of the mistakes, but also the consultative procedure that allowed them to occur. And this gets to be a fairly tricky and dangerous situation. Now, it's obvious that no system can avoid errors, but we should be aware that other systems might work better than the one we have, especially in other countries. Now, I think that Taiwan has provided a stunning example to bear out this premise. There, the pattern of consultation is essentially reversed from what we do. Representatives of other ministries participate regularly in the deliberations and decisions of national science policy agencies. Now, it's not easy to establish what why underlies successful technological innovation, but it is noteworthy that Taiwan has been enormously successful in very recent years. New technology for growing mushrooms, asparagus, and eels has developed in the country and given rise to entirely new industries within a 5-year period, which in 1972 yielded more than $100 million in export income for the country. Now, I don't maintain that consultation in this country should be reformed to emulate the apparently successful Taiwanese system. In fact, I think we learned something by consideration of the probable problems that we would face if we tried to implement the transfer of their consultation technology to this country. I can imagine the reactions of Americans. This would be both scientists and non-scientists. If representatives of the Departments of Defense and Transportation were routinely appointed to the board of the National Science Foundation or to the National Research Council, scientists in this country would consider this to be a clear crime against nature, and laymen would probably also be terribly apprehensive. Now, the fact is that our culture is so structured as to preclude the procedure, irrespective of its merit in some abstract sense. Now, if we realize this fact, I think it helps a little bit in understanding why some very reasonable American technologies just are not amenable to easy transfer across cultural borders. Now, I really turn to the title of my lecture. Now, why should we seek to develop science in LDCs? And why help them develop technology? Now, there's no question but what those nations want technology because they aspire to the acquisition of some features of our national lifestyle which are uniquely dependent upon technology. Now, no matter how much the technically advanced nations emote about the problems like industrial pollution, the LDCs are just determined to have a larger piece of the action before the game is called off. Now, this dilemma was brought to focus very neatly at a marine ecology conference held in Malta in the summer of 1972. There's a crisis situation in the Mediterranean because it's very rapidly becoming a dead sea because of the disappearance of animal and vegetable life in the ocean because of polluting materials dumped into it. Now, the northern countries, France, Italy, Yugoslavia, are much interested in talking about moratoria on development of more industries to add to this destructive effluent. But quite understandably, the North African nations reject these suggestions with a good deal of cynicism. And, of course, they have the southern half of the ocean, sea, and they're not going to be told what not to put into it, not at this time. It's also clear that LDCs want to import science as well as technology. But there I don't think the rationale is nearly as obvious. One reason has been pointed out to me by C.N.R. Rao, who was an Indian chemist who spent many years in this country before returning to India, where he has now become one of the country's most influential citizens. Now, Rao has told me that, in his opinion, one of the strongest reasons for Indians to do science publishable in the most prestigious international journals is the beneficial effect that this will have on national self-esteem. The feeling that we are as capable as anyone helps keep alive the hope that in time India can become competitive in the vastly more difficult arena of advanced technology. You see, looking at it in this light, international class science, whether or not it immediately does something functional for the Indian people in a material way, does the same sort of thing that successful entrants in the Olympics do for a poor and underprivileged nation. That's a place where they can be competitive. The fact is that India can afford a little science. It's questionable just what it can afford in the way of technology, because science is obviously vastly less expensive than technology. Now, this reasoning, I think, may be a lot sounder than others which are more often cited. This reason for wanting science to grow in an LDC. Now, a common rationalization is the notion that the development of capability in pure science will inevitably lead to development of new derivative technology. Americans in particular are very forceful salesmen for this point of view, because that's the way in which the action is perceived to have occurred in this country. Now, in fact, I think that the reasoning seems to have only limited validity. The likelihood that basic science, as it's now done in an LDC, will lead to innovative indigenous technology is really rather small. For one thing, the science is usually so highly emulative of that which is done in the ODCs as to be really duplicative in principle. Problems for study are usually chosen for the sole purpose of gaining international respectability in science, rather than because they're truly novel or related in some direct way to national needs. Now, this ethic is a comfortable one for scientists in any country, and it's usually reinforced by the hard sell from friendly American scientists. I think that we encourage this in many ways, and with good intent. Now, actually, cold-blooded appraisal suggests that if the work will be done somewhere anyway and published in international journals, the speed of the reflection of the results in new technology in country X is not necessarily increased by having another version of the same work done in X. Now, at times I've been pretty critical of what I see of the redundancy of much of the research which is done in the advanced countries, including the United States. Scientists are addicted to bandwagon jumping, and there's a strong indication that in the global growth of science simply creates more and more dedicated addicts. Now, furthermore, there's another factor which we have to bear in mind, and that is conversion of new science to new technology. In West Europe, the United States, and Japan has been implemented by a powerful force of applied scientists who work in highly directed industrial and government laboratories. Now, this effort is very costly and can only be carried on by a cumulative process. Technological development as it's now carried on here and in Japan, requires as the base an already profitable industry to generate resources to recycle into new development. I mean, this is just the way it works now. Now, those conditions, of course, don't exist in the LDCs for the most part. Most ambitious LDCs have established some kind of a system of national laboratories with a mandate to do technical research and development directed toward national development. The success of these laboratories, as nearly as I can judge, has been very varied. It's my impression that the national laboratories in India have produced relatively little. And if this is so, it may be because they have tried to emulate too much, too closely, the style of our own AEC labs as they perceive them. However, I was very much impressed by some of the work in Ghanaian national laboratories, which have chosen to do what is scientifically very humble work directed toward utilization of the country's resources. I think they've done some very good and very effective things. Now, because I've been talking about the evolution of indigenous technology in a developing nation, and it's obvious that it's very difficult, and it's obvious that I do not see an easy and automatic reflection of serious, dedicated scientific work with this as a necessary result. So alternatives have to be considered. The importation of existing systems from advanced nations is something which is a principal subject of a number of the papers in this symposium. It seems that in many instances, this is really the only viable alternative to importation of the finished products of the technology. For example, the prospect of developing a homegrown technology for production of synthetic fibers in Colombia seems impossibly remote. If Colombians are going to use synthetic fibers, they must either buy the fibers or acquire the existing processes for making them from another nation. Now, unfortunately, the most desired technologies, the ones which are most coveted, frequently turn out to be capital-intensive ones, so that their transfer to a country which has a labor-intensive economy produces really mind-boggling problems of all kinds. And again, Dr. Dahl mentioned some of these this afternoon. I don't think that any fully satisfactory strategy for accomplishing this has been devised. Now, for a lot of reasons. An important one is that the advanced nations have never felt able to make extensive gifts of some kinds of technology, complete with hardware and installation services. Because both the United States and the Soviet Union have built dams for undeveloped countries, partly because the product of the technology is not obviously directly exportable. But I really doubt that we're ever going to get around to making a gift of an automobile assembly plant to any country which is likely to use it well enough to begin competing in the international market. It just does not seem to be in the cards to do this. Now, technology is for sale, and the outright purchase of it is a reasonable tactic if the client nation has capital to invest. Japan has been a very heavy purchaser of American and European technology and is now selling a lot of their own back to us and to others. The Soviet Union does the same sort of thing. They buy some and they sell some. Whether or not this kind of thing will remain a viable system is, I'm afraid, a moot question. This time there are many people in the United States who are pressing for either a very drastic increase in the price of exported technology or a total ban on the sales. And I hope that common sense will prevail and the most extreme restrictions will not be imposed. However, I think we must face the fact that the affluent nations are not necessarily eager to part with technology which will ultimately erode their dominance in international commerce. Now, I have no doubt that there was going to be very extensive purchase of technology by the oil-rich nations during the next 10 or 15 years. Now, as a part of this action, the prices are going to go up a great deal. The royalty systems are going to be redone. The charges for made to a nation which wants to buy an oil refinery and have it installed, the price is going to go up at least by as large a factor as the price of oil is going up. Now, one of the consequences of this is that this all bodes no good at all for the poor nations of the world, who at the present time are hard-pressed to buy anything at the present rates. And the problems are going to become worse and worse. Now, there are other ways of going about it. And a long-established alternative to outright purchase is the use of foreign investment capital. And this has actually been a principal vehicle for industrialization of the undeveloped nations, as I guess everyone knows. In recent years, the principal mechanism for this has become the multinational corporations, which now terrify a lot of people because of their sheer magnitude. The U.S. has for a long time been a proponent of foreign investment, and we've considered it to be a mutually beneficial thing. And often we become bewildered by the hostility of people such as South Americans, who increasingly resent the presence of flourishing American-owned industries on their soil. Now, it's interesting to note that the U.S. position on this is becoming a little less dogmatic at the present time, because some apprehensions are being raised by the apparent intent of the Japanese to acquire title to all of Hawaii and a lot of other choice parts of the North American continent. You know, it's a little troublesome to see it happening in reverse. And so I think that our empathy for the ungrateful Chilean can be increased in a more genuinely feeling way. Now, India has for some time insisted upon partnerships, and new industries developed in that country must have half Indian ownership. Ghana is taking the same approach, except that they can only see their way clear to requiring a minimum 10% Ghanaian interest in new international ventures. There are still some problems which are not solved by the partnership scheme. There are also other problems in the transfer other than capitalization. When an LDC imports a sophisticated foreign technology, irrespective of the financial mechanism, a lot of things have to be worked out. This was discussed by both speakers this afternoon. The style of operation of capital-intensive American plant may be entirely incompatible with the social structure of another country and with its economic structure. Often it appears that plant after country gets it can only be operated if part of the labor force, and especially top management, is also imported. That costs more money. Usually this style of operation is adopted as a, quote, initial expediency, unquote, with the hope that the domestic labor force will take over after a short time. Unfortunately, it seems to turn out that this plan is usually just painfully slow in maturing. 2 years ago, the Ghanaian Minister for Industrial Development told me some of his problems in this area. He mentioned a motorcycle assembly plant in Kumasi, which is run by Yugoslavian engineers under contract. They run it very well, but after 15 years, domestic management is still not apparently ready to take over. And the poor man was just going bananas trying to figure out why. From my own brief observation, I've got to confess also to a total puzzlement. The Ghanaians are highly intelligent, extremely vigorous people, and so it's quite clear that something other than native ability is missing. And I think that it is not all poor intention or bad faith on the part of the contract managers from other nations. Something else just doesn't work, which we would assume will work. I suspect that one important factor in the success of our own technical society is that we're in a culture which more or less automatically produces many people who are equipped to fill middle and lower management roles in the system. This is a weakness in India, Brazil, and Ghana, which has been repeatedly pointed out to me by the most aware people in those countries. I suspect that probably some assistance in developing such non-glamorous capabilities, the ability to organize a dozen people and get them to come to the same place to go to work on something of a schedule and remember what they're supposed to do is a management capability, which we assume, because of the structures in our lives here, many people can do. Many people can do it. But this is not a part of the cultural heritage of people in many nations. Unfortunately, I don't see any surefire way to do the job of giving assistance in this, which appears to be one of the most critical areas in at least a number of the LDCs. Now, let me tell you about a desperate problem that exists in India, where large industrial development has been done largely by the partnership scheme. These partnership industries have produced very few jobs in research and development for Indian scientists. Consequently, the nation has a desperate problem in underemployment of young scientists, and it almost appears as though our attempt to export pure science to India may have created a really vicious human problem without providing any real help except to keep India visible in the International Scientific Olympics. And that's something, but it's not what people want. Now, at first glance, it's really curious that ICI of India, which competes in the international trade of synthetic fibers, does not have jobs in R&D. There is, however, a very simple answer. The company is half owned by the Indian government or Indian capital and half by British ICI. Obviously, the Indian company uses results of R&D done in Britain. Transfer of some of the R&D of the joint enterprise to India would make sense in the long run, but it's quite understandable that at the present time people fear to do this because the initial cost in money and time might hurt ICI India very badly in its present effort to produce international income by sale of fibers. It's just a very difficult thing to put together. Now, there's another kind of problem in technology transfer, and that's lack of sound judgment as to what client nations really need. There's an unfortunate tendency to use scarce funds to buy new Cadillacs when what is really needed is serviceable used Mustangs. For example, when a group of us visited Ghana, we were consulted about the purchase of a new high-capacity paper mill with a price tag of $20 million. Now, some of us knew of perfectly functional old paper mills in New England which are in mothballs and could probably be purchased for 1/10 of that price. Now, these mills were retired simply because their output is not competitive in an American society which seems determined to drown itself in paper. Now, since Ghana is not in that particular crisis situation, their use of paper is very considerably more reasonable than ours. A 1950-style mill will absolutely serve their national needs very well. Incidentally, it would also fulfill some of the criteria mentioned by Dr. Dahl in that it's somewhat more labor-intensive than are the bright, shining new mills which they're contemplating buying. Now, I don't know whether our advice was followed or not. You know, shopping for secondhand goods just doesn't have a lot of appeal to some nations who feel the need for at least a few examples of shiny new technology. Hey, he's really got them with him. You know, people, countries want some shiny new technology as a national status symbol. Now, no matter how illogical this seems, we Americans must realize the reality of status symbols because we're famous for our self-indulgence in this same kind of thing. I mean, it's a part of human nature or something like that. Well, time's getting on. Let me summarize these somewhat disconnected thoughts. I conclude that our present rather vigorous program of international exchange of science and scientists should continue. Perhaps we should be much more conservative than in the past in encouraging scientists and LDCs to simply follow in our own footsteps. And I believe we ought to soft-pedal a fairly pious hope that wonderful technological growth will automatically derive from creation of high-class scientific research. I just don't think this is necessarily true, and we ought to quit pushing it as an idea. I also believe that we should give a great deal of attention to the much more difficult problems of technological transfer, and therefore I'm enormously pleased that seminars such as this go on, directing attention to that. It's awfully easy to slip back and just doing a good neighborly job in transfer of science, because it's so much more easily done than transferring technology or helping the development of technology in some other place. Now, this will require attention to a wide variety of problems which are complicated, circumstances which are time variable, and which arise primarily from socioeconomic factors external to the technology itself. And again, we have heard about this today. We'll hear more about it. It's terribly important. If we're going to do the job, we must not insist even that we are pure technologists. We have to attempt things which relate to cultures, economics, weather, whatnot. Now, finally, I hope that we'll see the evolution in some LDCs of new technologies to produce products which are different from those which are now coming from the advanced nations. This is I think, a remote but highly valid goal. Now, actually, I don't see how American scientists can play a central role in this action. First of all, we're not there, and it's less likely that a bright new idea for a new thing which can come out of country X, which is not now coming from the United States or Germany, it's less likely to occur to us. And furthermore, people being as they are, as we all are, there's a high probability that if we conceive some highly attractive new product which can be put fruitfully into the world market for profit of supplier and customer both, we'll almost inevitably go ahead and produce it first ourselves. And this will therefore make it novel to this country and not to some other. Now, I think that the Foreign Office of the National Academy has played a powerful leadership role in international science and somewhat so in international technology. I hope that this will continue, but I also look forward to the time when more of the leadership will be effectively assumed by people from countries which now seem as essentially only dependent junior partners. This, I hope, doesn't sound like a simple pious hope, because it appears to me that it's the only truly valid long-range goal of an honest program for international development. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, George. Dr. Hammond, one of the gave the field
Yeah, I think I understand the thrust of your suggestion, and I think it has some validity. Obviously, it's not immediately in the short range, directly in the interest of the foreign corporation to develop indigenous capability. However, it's not really contrary to it either. I mean, it's just something which is fairly neutral because, you know, if the MNC owns the business, it really doesn't matter too much to the profit structure whether or not it's run in the LDC by foreign managers or domestic managers. And the fact that there isn't therefore a strong immediate gain from developing domestic management capability just means that it's not a high priority item. And I don't think that the system necessarily works against it. I think it means that it's something which is considered to be, yeah, a good idea, something which would be fine to happen, but not something which necessarily is pursued aggressively. And so I see it as a somewhat more complicated situation than some people see it. There are other problems, too, which I'm sure that everyone has encountered, and that is that the cultural adaptation required to develop the indigenous capability for management is a very serious strain. Now, I didn't visit the Firestone plant in Ghana myself, but some other people in our group did. I'm very impressed with it. It's a well-run plant. It's run by an old American chemical engineer who was sort of a bull of the woods type, and he runs a tight ship and it works. He furthermore has developed some Ghanaian managers in very much the same philosophy, but they are so tough, even tougher than he is, that they have become completely alienated from the Ghanaian workers. And so he can get along with the Ghanaian workers in the plants better than they can. And so the cultural strain on these individuals has required them to undergo over-adaptation, apparently, to the extent where their apparently high efficiency and capability becomes wasted. And so there are problems like that which turn up, too. I mean, it's obviously a hellishly complex thing. And I think that if there were very strong short-range motivation for the MNC to develop native management capability, they probably would do it a lot faster than they do now. As it is, what people perceive as a long-range advantage to it. Because if it does become an indigenously operated operation, the chances that it will survive without being expropriated are increased. As this, of course, is the threat which always hangs over these international corporations, is that if the country so decides, it can grab it. And the rate of grabbing is going to be slowed down by really highly constructive interaction of this with the local society. And this is realized, but I'm afraid that it isn't realized with the kind of passion and aggressiveness that I think would be helpful. I call it ODC, overdeveloped country. I quite agree. You know, I couldn't possibly. This wasn't such a hot lecture in some ways, partly because I tried to talk about too many things and lots of other things I obviously didn't say. You know, I entirely agree with you. This question is of cultural adaptation as a part of technology transfer is just an unbelievably complicated thing. I'm just beginning to learn a little bit about it, and it's staggeringly difficult to understand. There are many approaches to understanding it which we and others probably should work on. You know, I suspect rather strongly that, you know, the Philippines, to pick a case, ought to be taking a hard look, just as hard as they can, at how things have developed during the past 25 years in People's Republic of China. They probably will learn some things from that which they can never learn from us. And I think it's probably more appropriate that they do this study for themselves rather than trying to do it through us. Back corner. Okay, as I think there are two parts to this question. Let me answer the first one first. The matter of availability of replacement and maintenance parts is probably very good, simply because there are quite a number of mills of the same kind still in operation. And it isn't just a single mill in mothballs, there are quite a number of them. And so they're obviously an extant source of replacement parts. The second part is, no, American universities don't do a damn thing to teach anything to anyone in the area of skills and expertise that you talk about. Some of such training does go on in some American institutions, but they're not universities. And another crying need in most of these countries is to develop a fairly large number of people with capability in machine tool work, small design problems, so forth. I mean, this is a critical.